My name is Ramona, and I'm an integrative psychotherapist and somatic experiencing practitioner. And I'm truly glad to welcome you to this conversation about trauma. Andy Ryan, who is also an integrative psychotherapist, who has worked in the field of addiction for over 18 years. And I think what makes Andy's perspective so valuable is his passion for understanding how the therapeutic relationship sheds light on a personal, professional, and systemic processes. His ongoing curiosity has led him to a rich understanding of developmental trauma and the many ways humans adapt in the face of suffering.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So today's conversation invites us into something that's both deeply human and profoundly clinical, the experience of trauma and what it asks of us as therapists, but also as people. Trauma is a word that we hear more and more these days, and yet for all its visibility, it often remains misunderstood. So this conversation is an invitation to explore what trauma really is, how it impacts us, and how we can meet it in therapy through a relational and adaptive lens. At the same time, this discussion also offers a glimpse into the upcoming training we're preparing in Bucharest, a trauma training designed for therapists and professionals who want to go deeper into trauma-informed practice. So let's begin by grounding this discussion in who you are, not just professionally, but personally. So I would ask you, how would you introduce yourself beyond your professional title, and what first drew you into psychotherapy and then more specifically to trauma work?
What a question. What a question. I suppose a quick one from me, really, and thank you for the introduction. It probably echoes a little of the introduction, really, is and ties all of that together. Throughout my life experiences, I suppose, through things that had happened to me and what I'd witnessed happening around me, and then developmentally throughout life, I ended up in a place in my life around the age of, I'd say, kind of late 20s, 30s, not only in a lot of crisis, but what I would say is with a lot of curiosity and, if I'm truly honest, no understanding of trauma. I thought this was just what happened. This was life. And I didn't even have a language really to communicate this in. So I had a lot of curiosity. So I would love to say I trained to be a psychotherapist because I had this innate call to go and help people. I suppose selfishly, I was curious about me really and what was happening for me and how I met the world. And I went on some kind of basic counselling courses, and as is often the case in life, the right place at the right time, met the right people, and ended up training at a psychotherapy institute where I think dots started to join for me, not only about the work that I was involved with, why I was involved with it. I started to learn this language for who I was and how I met the world. And it not only made sense of maybe what my history was, but also kind of opened up doors for where I was going as well. So there was a real big process around all of that. So I would introduce myself as a phenomenally curious person after many years of probably being in the doldrums, really, of not having that curiosity and probably being too frightened to have that curiosity. So from survival to thriving, I think at the minute is how I'd probably introduce myself, and learning all the time. So yeah, that's me. And lovely to meet everyone, particularly if you're watching this.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, and thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Was there a moment in your career that made it clear how essential a trauma-informed approach is?
The trauma, simplistically, and this is, it probably never is this straightforward, but I think potentially because I've worked in the addiction field, what I noticed was a felt sense of like frustration because people were always talking about drugs and alcohol. And I couldn't shake that. I couldn't, and some of that came from my own lived experience of having problems with drugs and alcohol. But it wasn't just that. It was meeting like hundreds and hundreds of people because I was working in like in the UK, we've got commission treatment services. You meet lots of different people throughout kind of years of working in the sector, and hearing like that, it was like the data capture. How much are you using? How do you use it? Can we reduce? And it was very structured and what I was seeing when I was sitting with people was distress, was anxiety, was fear, was trauma. And then it started to like separate for me a bit. There was the trauma of living the lifestyle that was this relationship with substances, and then there was this kind of like, what brought you here trauma as well. And it was amazing when I started kind of working in the sector, meeting more people and just sitting with people and just asking them really relationally, what is this for you then? You know, what is this for you? And people started talking about their trauma. And I think that's when it became very figural for me, Ramona. That was this moment of like, I work in the addiction services. No, I you know, I don't think I do. I think I work in a people service. I think I work in a health service. I think I work in it's more than that. And it became so important for me then that I would annoyingly so challenge people, you know, that were very focused on, you know, the war on drugs. And I just think it's not. It's actually as about helping people kind of make sense and meaning of this relationship they might have with any kind of substance that was really important. And that's where I find myself bumping straight into trauma. This is about trauma. And I suppose that's what I would say. That's when trauma became really figural for me, Ramona.
Thank you so much, Andy. How do you define trauma in your own work?
But I've always liked that kind of starter for 10 definition around kind of trauma is like, it's not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. How we manage that, you know, or what that does for us, or how we adapt and how we, so you know, thinking about, you know, because when I first started, you know, exploring around trauma, I genuinely was, my threshold was up here. It was life-threatening, anything that was a risk to life or your safety, you know, at the most extreme end. And I think that spoke a lot potentially for my history, but also some of the services that I found myself working in as well. I find myself almost grading things in severity and not just like meeting the individual. It was as was just said there, it was consequential. It was like, how bad is this then, and how bad was that? And you know, and sometimes really sadly, and I have to own this as probably as shameful as it is, it was like almost how graphic as well was something that would be traumatizing and not the case. And that's why I needed to really kind of set out on an education around trauma and understanding. So that kind of, that, you know, it's about what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. And then all that kind of organic psychological process that encases all of that. That was a relief to me to be able to go, okay, I can breathe into that and start sitting with people in that space. So that was kind of my early, and still today I would say, a frame of reference for trauma, because obviously it's unique. It is as unique as we are individual, you know, at times. But I needed something as simple as that to just give me that frame of reference. One of the most amazing things, and it felt like someone had just put some 3D goggles on me at the time, when we start talking about like intergenerational aspects. I mean, I've worked with people that have explored this with me, but some days I look at what's happening around the world, and I look at and you think, yeah, not only are people kind of wrestling with intergenerational trauma, but we're seeing this happening now that future generations are going to be picking up on as well. And I think, as you were saying earlier, that idea of having a narrative and a communication, 3D goggles for me was, I was always looking for that traumatic event. I worked with far more people that was more subtle. It was about the absence of things, because it wasn't a big event that I should be writing a risk plan for, or writing. I missed so much early on, if I'm really honest. And again, that was the importance of supervision. That's the importance of training. That's the importance of, you know, picking those books up and starting to read and learn.
So widening a bit the lens, what do you think is missing in the public conversation about trauma, and maybe what are the most common misunderstandings about it?
Straight away, for me, that the second part of that question just, it jumped out at me there, Ramona, when I was thinking of those common misunderstandings. And one of the core ones for me is, and I've worked in services that have started to talk about kind of trauma-informed practice, and it's almost like it's something that needs to be fixed. It's like when someone's experienced trauma, how do we mend you? How do we fix you? And how do we kind of move you on, really? And that lack of understanding about the the existential nature of trauma, what that might mean to someone. And also, I think, and I think you've already alluded to this, Lydia, earlier in the conversation, this notion that somewhere out there's a therapy system that's got a time frame for helping to heal is phenomenal. So I think there's something in that where we particularly in the UK, we have systems set in place where unfortunately they're not helpful because they probably cement some of this narrative in. It's like, well, but you reached out, but you got the help though, didn't you? It's like, well, it's not quite as finite as that, you know. And we probably need more work publicly. It always reminds me of a conversation I had where I was working with a service and they were talking about getting almost like a qualification, a standard of, you know, being trauma informed. And all I said to them was, I think we absolutely need to be looking at how we practice and how we can best support people. And sometimes doing that through a lens of being trauma informed is really important. Well, but we don't need trauma informed services. We need trauma informed societies. That's what we need. So a bit like years ago, what we could really do within the UK, and I'm not sure if this is the same across the kind of whole of Europe, because I'm not that well kind of versed, but I remember years ago, we had this whole Time to Talk campaign about mental health. We need to start talking about mental health in the organic way. It is just like any other kind of organ in the body. We're looking after our minds. We're looking after it. We need to talk about it and not see it as a problem. I sense we probably need to do that around trauma as well, and start to understand more about what this actually means for people before it becomes a badge or a label or a hindrance to actually getting help.
I would turn a bit the discussion to what this actually looks like in a therapy room, if you're okay with that. So, as therapists, how can we begin to recognize when trauma may be present in a client's story, even if it's not named directly? Or maybe what are the first signs that a client may be carrying it with him trauma?
Something that really helped me developmentally as well, I was very fortunate that in one of my roles, I was leading group therapy in an addiction center. And that was a place where you could have, you know, anything up to 12 or 13 people in a group. And just as you both have mentioned there, just non-verbally, what was being said in that room was immense. And you know, and almost, and I think a few people, yourself included today, Ramona, have used that phrase, that kind of felt sense. There was something like person to person there that was absolutely, you start to get a sense of, and the key word was around regulate. It was people almost just struggling to be there now, you know, really struggling, which was, and there can be other reasons when we think of things like neurodiversity, and we think of, you know, a myriad of physical problems that people might have, and just, you know, not always pathologizing, which is really important to me, but starting to get that felt sense of something. And it's really interesting when we talk about kind of being held, because eye contact was always a big thing for me, you know, with people, whether that be in psychotherapy rooms or even in group, that kind of eye contact, and that, again, what you could sometimes pick up from people. But that, I think, if I'm honest, that's a big thing for me historically as well. That was a definitely, when we think about regulating, eye contact was important for me to know what was happening in the environment. I could pick a lot up from eye contact as to what might be happening next. And I'm sure that's quite a human trait, not kind of some adaptive superpower. You know, we all kind of get that sense. But so that was always important. So when we talk about how do we know that, you know, trauma is present here, because I think there was, and again, apologies for this, because a lot of my experience just come from the addiction field, but there was always this assumption that if you've got a very detrimental relationship with substances, using substances at a level that's putting your health at risk on a daily basis, that's trauma. You know, so there was always this assumption that, you know, there'd be levels of trauma, but really getting to know people and understanding what the formation of that relationship, and what kind of the driving energies. Often you would come up and people would start in their own language talking about that support that they'd had or didn't have, you know. So as we were saying earlier, for some people, they would often talk about horrific things that happened to them. For some people, they'd talk about the absence of those things they really needed, as well as other kind of life events. So that was my early sense, really, that trauma was in the field. And then really importantly, sitting with people so it didn't become a task. You know, it wasn't the drive of the therapy was to. I was fortunate to work in quite a lot of good therapy teams. It wasn't about, you know, having to understand it all, you know, because as Lydia was saying there, repeat, repair, rupture. You know, there's a risk that some of the services we offered would be repetition of trauma for people, if particularly if they just had to tell their story over and over again, which is one of the faults with a lot of systems in the UK, is to get a lot of support, you have to say a lot of things about what's happened to you, which in itself is not great. So it was interesting for me early on in my supervision. I used to use this word a lot, and it was like grading. And I felt like I was pathologizing, but probably didn't have the language at the time. And I know we've adopted a more medical phrase around kind of relational titration. It's like actually, as people titrate drugs, and that was one of the things for me as a therapist, would often be, it wouldn't be I think, you know, figuratively around the therapeutic work, there's definitely trauma here. But I would catch myself grading, I would catch myself titrating as a therapist, and paying attention to that as well. And interestingly, I think that bodily sense as well, thinking about the hyper and hypoarousal and what that does to the body, the breathing, and interestingly, one of my challenges that I've had to sit with over many years is working in an addiction field. I would often hear people talk about like DNA, did not attend.
Yeah.
That's called flight. I think what we had was, and this is truly is meant as a compliment. I've worked with people that really cared a lot, and what they would do sometimes is they would give what they thought someone needed. They would love someone. They would tell them positives. And it would rupture hideously, and we would have a did not attend appointment next. So we're back there again with another layer to say, you know, and I've sat with many people over the years, why should I trust you? And they've got a whole list of how this repetition has happened.
So I would like to explore more deeply through the lens of coping mechanisms, particularly those that were mentioned here, those that often carry shame, stigma, like addiction or emotional numbing. So I think if we view addiction as not a pathology, but as an emotional regulation strategy, how does that shift our therapeutic approach?
I mean, I've worked with this amazing group of people. There's this kind of, it's the NHS, so the kind of health service in England, and it's they call themselves the Addiction Provider Alliance, and they did a big campaign around stigma, and the tagline for that was just see the person, hear their story. And it was just really simple, and that's what they were saying is like when you see someone who might have a problem with drugs or alcohol, or before you judge, before you kind of put that layer on or start pathologizing them, just see the person and hear their story. And some of that was aimed at this, I think, just relating to your question there, Ramona, was relating to this kind of, if this is a regulation tactic or a soothing tactic, or however we choose to see that, how do we look at that and say, but okay, there's healthy alternatives to this then? Okay, you know, what you're doing is trying to survive. And it always reminds me of, I was working in a region once, and the service had hostel accommodation for people who had nowhere to live, rough sleepers. And I went into the premises, and outside, sitting on the bench, was a guy who just looked like something bad had just happened. And I sat next to this guy on the bench, and I said, "Is everything okay? You're just checking in, and you know, how are you doing?" And he said, "Well, they've got me a place in here." So, and naturally, me being kind of working in the sector, I thought that's really good news. It's really, really good news. The idea of being in a 32-bed hostel accommodation was terrifying for this guy, and he was about to just walk out the front gate and go and get a drink. Now, he'd done a lot of work around his addiction, and to everyone else, they would see that like as a relapse, as a catastrophe, as a not okay. Right now, in this moment, you were feeling re-traumatized about the idea of walking into this building, and you're going to go and do that thing you do to regulate and soothe or whatever. Okay. And it was one of those moments where we started a conversation about the healthy alternatives. Okay, but if you didn't do that, what could we do? You know, is there a different way here? And I was just chatting with this person, and even in that moment, and not suggesting that this isn't a kind of a Disney movie and everyone was happy ever after. It's like, okay, there's a difficult road ahead still. Yeah. But even in that moment, just being seen, being heard, being understood felt better for that person. It started something. He had a different experience with me than he'd just had, where he'd been told, this is what you're doing. And I just thought, no one actually, going back to that, see the person, hear the story. No one said, okay, great news, we've got this thing, because they're really difficult to get a bed in these places. But how do you feel about that? It was system. We've solved a problem. Okay, you can go here. Right, next problem, please. There was a whole pathology there around, you're a rough sleeper, you're in addiction, and actually see the person, hear their story, it wasn't suitable for them to be in that place at all. They had a whole story to tell you why, as well, if you got to know them, of which I did. I actually got to know this person over time, and they had a whole story behind it. And I think that was really important for that. Patience is always needed, obviously, with the healthy alternatives, because again, I think, I come from an era where I went to see a GP about my drug and alcohol problem, and he said, why don't you just stop? So that was the solution-focused therapy I got back in the day. Rather than, okay. Needless to say, whilst I valued his 7 years training as a doctor, I absconded from his advice, really, and went out and did a bit more research with my relationship with substances before it actually came to a close. So yeah, but it's adaptive, isn't it? And my worry is then we're getting into the layers of, put this person in that hostel, and there's another layer coming, because he's going to have to adapt again. The more and more you adapt, and it feels quite dramatic saying it, but it's like I'm further away from knowing you. The more layers get added. I said that in therapy once, Leah, when I talked about my relationship with substances. I remember categorically saying, it's like, there's nothing that we're going to do in here that will work quicker than that relationship. I didn't totally understand at the time the thing I was seeking from substances, whether it be dissociation and desensitization. But in the early years, what I was chasing was this sense of freedom, where I didn't have to worry about just being. I didn't, and that's the trauma. The trauma was always there, and I didn't have any way of coping and understanding, and to live day in, day out with this process that was happening. That substances was just, it was almost flip a switch. But it didn't help me regulate. It didn't help me make sense and meaning of anything. It just dissociated and desensitized me, and then I just functioned on, really.
If you could offer just one message or one piece of wisdom drawn from your experience to a therapist who is just beginning their journey into trauma work, what would that be?
The first thing that springs out for me is looking after yourself. And I would love to be able to, if this was like a live stream and just hear people's feedback on that. I would love to hear whether it's like tarnished or even ingrained in me because of the sectors I've worked in, or whether this is a more general principle. Because I know, Lydia, Angela, we talk about this, and the importance of this, but it comes with a caveat for me, is like self-care, because we are aware of things like vicarious trauma and burnout and things like that. We are. But self-care also for me is about self-awareness. Is like I've had to invest just as much in me as I have for that person that I'm trying to help. And it kind of hit me like a sledgehammer. Really, was like, okay, Andy, what do you bring into this? I'm like, whoa, I'm the therapist. What do you mean? I'm just there to help. It's like, no. Things could go drastically wrong if you're not aware of who you are, mate.
Until next time, maybe, may this be not the end of a conversation, but the beginning of many. So until then, may we listen deeply, may we stay curious, may we remember that maybe even a small act of attunement, maybe a look, can open the door to genuine change. And thank you so much.